Good evening. My name is David Willis, and I'm the Lifelong Learning Librarian at the Burbank Public Library. Welcome to tonight's program, part of the 2020 Burbank Reads series. Tonight's offering is Antiracism in Action, an interactive workshop featuring Kalyn Wilson from Dream Forward Consulting. During this 90-minute workshop, she will help you learn to put anti-racism into action by learning the history of the Black experience in America, how bias works, and how you can take actions to become an ally. Burbank Reads is a program inspired by the idea that the shared act of reading can bring the community together. Everyone in the community is encouraged to read the same book and participate in discussion and learning surrounding the subject matter. Our main title is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. We have print and ebook copies available through our library website, burbanklibrary.org. And we hope you'll check it out and join in a book discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so we can all enjoy this online program. You should see our speakers on the screen. As audience members, you will not be able to speak, but you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of the window. Throughout the program, you are welcome to type questions in there. We will take questions at the end. When you leave the program, you will be redirected to an evaluation form, and we would greatly appreciate it if you could fill that out to help us improve our programs in the future. We'd like to thank the Friends of the Burbank Public Library for their sponsorship of this program. Now, I'll turn it over to our moderator, the director of the Burbank Public Library, Elizabeth Goldman.
Thank you very much, David. I would just, on behalf of the whole Burbank Library staff, I would like to welcome everyone to our program tonight. This is not only the first big program launching Burbank Reads, which we ran for many years and then took a break for many years and brought back this year. This is also our first big online program. So cross your fingers for us and please bear with us if we have any technical challenges. But I just wanted to say a brief word about why we brought back Burbank Reads this year. It's obviously been a very challenging stretch of time in our community, our country, and the whole world. Not only the pandemic that began in March, but then over the summer, there was a social protest, and there were some really important and good and sometimes difficult conversations that started happening in Burbank. Those are going on. We at the library, one of our goals is to bring the community together to have important conversations and to work toward bringing people together. And so we wanted to utilize our resources to help make sure the conversation continued, and also to try to gather some ideas from community members about further actions that we can take. So I'm really excited for our speaker tonight. Kalyn Wilson is someone I just met earlier this year, and she's got a great wealth of background and a wonderful, warm style. And I'm looking forward to what we all will learn together tonight. So I'll turn it over to you, Kalyn.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you so much to the Burbank Public Library as well as the community at large for being willing to host me tonight. I'm really excited to share this information with you all and to connect with you, even if it's virtually, because this is a very important topic in our country, but also in the community. So much has happened this year around understanding each other and understanding our shared and individual experiences. And a huge part of that has been conversations around racism. And the concept of anti-racism has now come to the forefront of our collective psyche. And so I wanted to spend some time talking to you all about how to put anti-racism into action. I know for a lot of us, it's been a little daunting to sort through all of the information. And so I'm all about action steps, which we can put into place now to actually bring that to a sense of shared responsibility, but also shared success in dismantling some of the systems which we have now come to realize are not the ways in which we want to represent ourselves as a community. So this is Anti-Racism in Action, how to be anti-racist and mean it. So tonight we're going to spend time talking about why now, and then we'll go into detail speaking about the escalating events which have led us to the point that we want to understand more about anti-racism. I'm also going to spend time talking to you all about definitions that'll happen throughout throughout this presentation, because I think that shared vocabulary is important, and I think it's extremely important for everyone to understand what we mean when we say certain words. I also want to talk about a timeline. So I want everyone to understand the Black experience in America over the past few centuries, as well as key events which have shifted the narrative over time. And then I'm also going to talk to us about understanding bias. So what is bias? What does it look like when we show bias? And how can we be more conscious of the biases that we all have and ways to work around them in our quest to be anti-racist? And then finally, I'll talk to you about actions which you can take right now. So let's start with setting the foundation and understanding the why as well as the ask. So right now in this country, we have seen an escalation of tension really starting from the earliest parts of this year due to the extended shelter in place orders. And so for many of us, this is now going on 8 months where we have been forced to stay inside, or we haven't been able to go to our workplaces, and we haven't been able to engage with our community in the ways which most of us are used to. And so with that, there has been an increased visibility of certain instances of violence because everybody is at home and we've all been turning to social media to understand and make sense of the world around us. So with that, we've seen more and more videos of police violence. In many ways, it was catalyzed by the killings of Ahmaud Arbery as well as George Floyd. And so many of us were disgusted. We were shocked by what we saw. And as a result, it led us to ask questions, which previously we hadn't really asked before. And so with those questions came a sense of sensitivity where we felt raw, we felt vulnerable, we felt exposed. And for some of us, that exposure was our ignorance to the lived experiences of other people who are around us, or other people who previously we may not have even paid attention to. We've also experienced a sensitivity in our feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. So when you're watching something and you don't quite know how to take action to support somebody when you want to, or to speak up, that can lead us to feel a level of disjointedness. We can feel confused, we can feel disillusioned. And so all of that sensitivity has led many of us to turn to social causes like Black Lives Matter movement, as well as other community-based organizations, which we may know of or recently heard of, as a way to process through that sensitivity and understand what we can do. And then finally, for many of us, our companies have become involved in these causes. So previously, you may have worked for a company which didn't mention a whole lot about racism or anti-Blackness. And so now you're probably seeing that your company has either put up a post about Black Lives Matter, or they are getting involved in certain causes. They may be offering incentives for people to speak up on behalf of their Black colleagues. And so for a lot of us, we're now wondering, well, where do I fit in that equation and what should I be doing? So let's talk definitions. Let's just start with just like a baseline definition to understand, first of all, what is allyship? So when we think about allyship, because this is a word that has been tossed around a lot, the core of allyship is that it is ongoing or continuous support for an underrepresented group. And that underrepresented group could cross many different dimensions of diversity. It could be around sexual orientation. It could be allyship for people based on gender. It could be allyship based on country of origin, or it could be allyship based on racial identification and ethnic identification. So in the case which we'll be discussing tonight around anti-Black racism and anti-racism, we're going to specifically be talking about how to be an ally to the Black community. There are 4 key pillars of allyship, and those pillars are visibility. So how are you positioning yourself to make sure that you are always giving visibility to the underrepresented group as opposed to centering yourself in the visibility and being seen? Consistency. So you also want to think about, how often am I actually showing up for this community? If I only show up once a year, or if I only show up if someone asks, technically that isn't really being an ally, because an ally is consistent in it at every opportunity that's presented. Also, we want to think about authority. An ally recognizes that they are not the authority on this particular issue because it is not their lived experience. And that's something that a lot of people really struggle with, because when you put in work to become knowledgeable and you read books and articles and you're watching content and you're educating yourself, then you feel like, hey, I should be able to speak on this. But we always have to prioritize the lived experience of someone else, because the lived experience is the greatest experience and the greatest teacher that you can ever have for any lesson. So again, I just really want to hone in on that authority, that the authority on discussing anti-Blackness and anti-racism is always going to be a Black person, because it is their lived experience of racism. And then finally, being flexible. This one is really important because, again, for a lot of us, this year has completely upended our sense of community, as well as our sense of self, and sometimes our sense of purpose in this work. And so we have to be flexible to recognize that as underrepresented groups find their voice, certain things, beliefs, whether that's beliefs, values, or even facts in some cases, which we have long held as truth, they may shift and change. So one example is understanding the concept of microaggressions, which we're going to talk about later. People are realizing that some things that they didn't know that bothered their Black colleagues, all of a sudden they're hearing like, wow, that's offensive to you, I didn't know, right? And so then as an ally, you have to be flexible to say, even though I wasn't aware that this was an issue before, I trust your lived experience and that you're the authority on what bothers you, and you're the authority on what is considered wrong toward you. So I'm going to trust that and change my behavior. So the focus here is on partnership and progress, right? So you want to think about, how am I partnering with my Black colleague or my Black friend or my Black community member to be able to say, hey, I support you in your quest for equality and in creating a world where we are all seen as being equally as valuable and deserve the same level of nurturing and care. And it's a progressive act. So this is not everybody wakes up tomorrow and somebody waves a magic wand or they snap their fingers and there's no more racism. We have to make progress on these things, because what we've learned about systemic racism is that it is entrenched in so many layers of society that it's very difficult to always just point out one key thing. It's built in and it's a tightly wound web, which we have to unwind little by little by little. So again, the focus is on progress, not just performance. So some other key terms. As an ally, again, we've talked about allyship just now, but I just want to hone in on the fact that an ally is a person who is continuously supporting underrepresented groups to be seen as equal, and that could cross many different dimensions of diversity. Also, we want to think about anti-racism as the act of purposely, deliberately, and consistently breaking down the system of racism in America and really the world at large. Bias is our own preferences or the ways in which we show up differently or think differently about other people or other groups versus ourselves. And everyone has biases. So for example, I am a native Detroiter. I was born and raised in Detroit. So I have a little bit of bias with thinking that Detroit is the best city in this country. You probably think that Burbank is too. So if we were having a discussion, we probably would not agree on that. So sometimes biases can be as innocent as, I prefer my hometown to any other place. But then there are other times where bias becomes really dangerous, such as when we say, if I see a Black person with a hoodie on, they're seen as dangerous, and I need to take action to protect myself, including the use of violence, right? And there are tons of things in between those extremes too. So discrimination is where we take our biases and take action against them, either in thought, word, or deed, to actively prevent someone else from having the same experience as us. So discrimination could be, I don't rent my home to I don't rent my rental property to Black people because I think that they are more destructive than non-Black people. So I choose not to take them on as renters. That's an example of discrimination, because you've now taken your bias against Black Americans and turned it into an action which prevents them from having an experience of having access to equal access to housing. Diversity is the presence of many different people who have different identities. So you can think of diversity as the numbers game. So diversity is simply saying who is at the party. And usually you see like a party analogy where they say diversity is a party, but inclusion and equity go a little bit deeper with that. So equity, on the other hand, is actually saying who has the ability to influence the community in the same way. So when you experience a sense of equity, no one voice is more important than the other. And it's really like a true democracy from the standpoint that it belongs to the people and it belongs to the community, and everyone has equal access to say, this is important, this is what we want to see happen, versus one group having more power than another to kind of make demands and make cause other people to have a different experience, excuse me. And so then inclusion is saying not only who is present, but it's also saying who gets to have a voice, period. So we haven't gotten to the point of whether or not the voices are equal with inclusion, but we're saying we're at least listening to the voices that we've allowed to be present from a diversity perspective. So I want to create almost like a pathway for that. So if we were to think of diversity, then inclusion, then equity. So diversity, again, is just the presence of many different people with different identities. Inclusion is saying that the people who have showed up in the diversity piece now have a voice and are recognized and seen, and they're visible. And then equity says not only do those people get to be visible and just be seen and heard at all, but their voice carries all the same weight and they can have equal influence over their lived experience. Intersectionality is where you have multiple identities, which when combined create a unique experience. So intersectionality was actually developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, who did incredible work around this. And it was originally designed to describe the very unique experiences which Black women have with both racism and sexism or gender-based discrimination. So her work basically said, yes, there is racism against Black people. And yes, women experience a special type of gender discrimination. However, for Black women, those two identities combined create a unique experience that makes their brand of racism and their brand of gender-based discrimination different from white women and from Black men. So with intersectionality, it's now expanded to include other parts of the identity. So for example, if someone were a Black transgender woman, right, they would have a very unique experience than a Black cisgendered woman, right? But again, I just want to hone in on the fact that the original definition spoke to the Black woman experience and how that is unique from Black men and from white women. So racism is the system of bias which creates a drastically different experience for white people and non-white people. And tonight we're going to focus on anti-Black racism, which is specific to the experiences of Black people. But I want to hone in on the fact that the system is what matters with racism. So racism is not just somebody calls somebody a name. Racism is the system that allows microaggressions, that allows housing discrimination, that allows political discrimination. So all of these systems wound up together creates this very tightly constructed building, which we're now trying to implode and dig ourselves out of. And finally, social justice is the system by which we are working and the process by which we're working to dismantle those racist systems and other forms of oppression and discrimination too. And it's how we're coming together as a community and as people to say, you know what, the ways in which we're showing up in the world today is not how we want to show up for ourselves and for our children and generations beyond. So we're actively doing the work to dismantle those systems. All right, so that was a lot to think about, right? And so I want us to be thoughtful about how these definitions hit us, right? Because again, for some of us, we have only heard some of these words in pop culture or in recent media. And so I want us to be sensitive to understand the definitions that you just heard now versus the definitions, the working definitions, which you may have heard before. So I want to ask the question, which of the preceding words is most familiar to you? And then which definition was most unfamiliar to you?
And while everyone is reflecting, just because we aren't all here together in the room, how we decided to handle this was that I would share my reflections and then let everyone reflect. And I would say that most familiar to me probably was social justice. Working in the field of libraries, I think is very aligned with social justice, and I've been doing that for a long time, but that isn't to say that it doesn't make me think about it differently when thinking about it in the context of race. A lot of the definitions, you know, I think they are words we hear all the time. I'm going to say I appreciate your definition of anti-racism because I was challenged on that word by a community member just earlier this week, and I realized that I didn't know exactly how I would define it. So, to think of it as the actions is really important, and probably in terms of discomfort. I'm going to say racism because in the recent discourse, there's been this, or at least something I've experienced in the recent discourse, and I don't think I'm the only one, is the shift from thinking about racism as one person who's saying terrible things.
Correct.
And then to thinking about it as the system and the structures. And there's, it's a difficult mental activity in many ways to shift your thinking, and it's easier in many ways, I think, to focus on some kind of evil person who's probably also a stereotype and in some ways, and then to realize that it's a system and we're all part of a system is a very challenging thing to really internalize and embrace and admit.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that vulnerability. And to everyone out there, as you reflect as well, thank you so much for being willing to reflect on this and continue to, because we're all challenged in this way. When I start talking more about the history in Black America, I'm going to go into more detail. But to be honest, even Black people are learning the ways in which we show up as anti-Black, right? And the ways in which sometimes we can undermine our own community, right? But all of us have a part to play in this system, because all of us have a certain form of privilege in some way. So even me as a Black woman, I'm not privileged as far as my gender or my race, but I'm privileged in terms of my religious beliefs because I align to a mainstream religion, right? Which is generally pretty accepted in the, in mainstream community. I'm also privileged from an education standpoint, right? Because I have a certain education level and that has given me access to certain things. And so I know I have blind spots with certain things too. So that level of vulnerability and confronting what is uncomfortable to you is going to be very important to the process of becoming anti-racist, because the person in which you have the most influence and control over is going to be you. So the ways in which you challenge your own thoughts are always going to be the most impactful, because you are the beginning of any change that you see. So I got some homework for y'all, because I love homework and I love challenging people to take action. I want you to try to find at least four media pieces. So this could be articles, blogs, podcasts, TED Talks, or anything that gives you an opportunity to learn and explore more, which discusses the definitions and applications of the word which you felt most uncomfortable with. So whatever definition made you kind of cringe a little bit, I want you to look that up. All right, so now let's talk timelines and key events. So the Black experience in America most likely began prior to 1619, but for sure, next slide. But the first documented presence of a person of African descent was in 1619. And some of you may be really familiar with that date now because of the New York Times work with the 1619 Project with Dr. Nicole Hannah-Jones. And so 1619, the first Africans were kidnapped and enslaved in America per written record. And so this begins this very long and complicated and often horrific journey of Black Americans. So from 1619 till about 1793, this is when slavery not only kicks off in America, but it's also escalating and is growing. And by 1793, the invention of the cotton gin explodes the slave trade as well as the US economy. So now the US economy is booming. And I also want to be clear that it's not just booming in the South, because a lot of times we think of racism as a Southern thing, but it is something that was also happening in the North as well, and as well as the expanding territory. So with every new state that came on board, slavery was always a part of the discussion about whether or not the state would allow Black Americans to be enslaved. And so with that, the economy is booming, and then conversations start to occur because of what's happening around the world with abolitionist movements. And as places in the world were eliminating slavery and stopping slavery, the question then became, okay, well, America, what are y'all gonna do? And so by 1831, the abolitionist movement is growing, and it ends up succeeding, of course, because of the Civil War, and slavery officially ends by 1865. Although it ended in some places before then because of the Emancipation Proclamation and other state laws which outlawed slavery over the course of the mid 1800s. So then when we get to the Reconstruction era, which occurred in the 1870s, this is where we start to see the rise of violent white nationalism. So in response to slavery ending, and this was in particular in the South, though again, I want to reiterate, this did occur in other states in the North as well, as a result of the ending of slavery and pushes for Black liberation in many ways, whether that's politically, socially, or economically. White nationalism, in particular, groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged and grew in prominence and power. And so by the 1920s, we kick off about a 50-year run of vacillating extremes of Black oppression and liberation movements, starting with the Harlem Renaissance, which of course occurred in the 1920s, mostly in northern cities. We also saw the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, but in between that time, we had huge issues with Black oppression around Jim Crow laws, which emerged over the course of Reconstruction and throughout and gained in prominence throughout the early 20th century as well. And then we also see some of the responses, particularly after the Vietnam War, in response to some of the progress which was made through the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And so by the time we get to the 1970s, we have the rise of what I consider hyper-capitalist expressions of Blackness. So in response to federally mandated freedoms, which Black people began to experience, most of what we began to see in popular culture gave these extreme perceptions and stereotypes, and we're going to talk more about them in a second, of what Black culture looked like. That, you know, Black people are taking all the jobs, and Black people are taking all the contracts, and Black people are just spending all of this money on welfare, and they're just taking everything, right? So we start to see these hyper-capitalist expressions, which mainly focused on an excessive use of resources in comparison to what people felt Black people deserved to be able to have access to and consume, which then led to the 1990s experience into the early 2000s, which is a cultural renaissance around urban culture or urban genres like rap and gangsta rap, or as we know as hip hop, R&B, as well as other expressions of Black intellectualism. So we had a lot of Black intellectuals start to come into prominence, as well as other Black liberation movements and groups which were pushing for what could be considered radical Black liberation, which now, ironically, is becoming more mainstream. So next slide. So I want you all to think for 1 second of what decade you were born. And I'm pretty sure everybody on the call is going to be at least in the 20th century, but just in case you were born in the late 19th century, you can make sure to, pick that one too. But think about what decade you were born. And then I want you to think about what are your earliest memories of Black people and Black culture. So what was the first time you saw a Black person? What was the first time you experienced some expression of Black culture? And then I want you to think about who is your favorite Black character from the decade in which you were born. And think about what were some of the characteristics that you saw from that person. So for example, for some people, their favorite Black character from that time is Sidney Poitier, because they may have seen him in different movies or TV shows. In some cases, for some people, they may have seen his character in the Heat of the Night movie, right? And the fact that he slaps this white law enforcement officer, I think that was the first time that a Black person was ever allowed to display violence toward a white person in a movie. And so, that's a pivotal moment in Black culture when you think about the fact that up to that point, the only expressions of violence he was seen were one way, were against Black people. But to now see that table turned, I'm sure there had to be a huge cultural shift. So for me, I'll pause here and just share my experience. I was born in 1985, I'm 35. And I grew up being completely entrenched in Black culture. And so the first Black person that I remember hearing about in Black culture or as representing Blackness was Barbara Jordan, because for some reason my family thought I reminded them of her. And so I remember just having this concept of wow, this is this really strong, intellectual, brilliant Black person who is an advocate for equality and just amazing at what she does. And that had a pivotal impact on what I felt I could achieve as a young Black girl and the limits that I felt were placed on me. So as you think about that, I also want you to think about what phase of Black history is most familiar to you. So no matter what decade you were born, all of us feel aligned to a particular decade, right? So some of us, we really dig the 50s and that's just our jam. And in our mind, it's still 1953, right? Because maybe we love the clothing or the music or the fashion. And so then I want you to think about what was occurring during that phase. And then I want you to think about what phase of Black history is most unfamiliar to you. And think about why, right? So if we could go back one slide, I just want to give you just one last glance at that, right? So for me, I feel really connected in particular to the 1970s and the civil rights movement because of honestly the work that I do now in DEI. And just because I just think that the 60s and 70s were just a super dope era in terms of culture with fashion and music and all the types of cultural expression. And so for me, I look at the principles of that era and I think about, okay, in what ways am I embodying that in my everyday life? And an era which I think is most unfamiliar to me and that I'd like to learn more about would be the period of 1793 to 1831, because I learned a lot about Black history growing up, as far as the earlier parts of slavery, the era of slavery, and I learned a lot about, of course, the Civil War and abolitionist movements, and then I learned a lot about the Reconstruction era. But that piece where the economy exploded, I see a disconnect for myself, and I want to dig into that more. So we're going to go ahead 2 slides. And my challenge to you there is just that you will continue to think that through and continue to think about, well, why is that unfamiliar to you and how you can begin to learn more about that. So I'm actually going to pause here and see if there are any questions out there. I think I see one in the chat. Let's see.
Yeah, the only question so far is a request for the list of terms. So we will get some terms and definitions on our library website within the next few days for people.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So let's talk unlearning anti-Blackness. Is deeper than the N word. So for a lot of us, we have heard like, just don't say that word, right? If you just don't say the N word, then like you're good. You're not racist. Nobody is anti-Black, but it's so much deeper than that. And when we talk about, again, the system of racism, it affects every single part of our lives, whether it is language, thought, politically, socially, economically. It is entrenched in every single part of our society. So again, when we talk about an ally, this is somebody who is offering ongoing support for someone or some people from an underrepresented group. Anti-Blackness are the specific thoughts, words, and actions which are in opposition to Black liberation. So anti-Blackness are, again, it's the thoughts that we think. So for example, if I think, oh, you know what, if I hire all of these Black people, then the quality of our department is gonna go down. That's anti-Black. If I say to a Black person, oh my gosh, you're so articulate, and almost as if we're shocked that someone could be articulate if they're Black, that's anti-Black. And if we take action against someone, such as actively working to ensure that a Black family can't purchase a home on our block, that's anti-Black. And the converse to anti-Blackness, or rather, I could even say the driver of anti-Blackness is the concept of whiteness. And I want to pause right here to really hone in on whiteness, because I know that that's probably going to be a really new concept for some of you. But whiteness is the backbone of anti-Blackness, because whiteness posits that the white racial identity experience is so normalized in this country and is so much the norm that it is considered the default. So everybody else is defined, but whiteness itself is the definition of what the experience looks like. So let's talk about what that could look like in practice. There has been a lot of conversation around hair, particularly with Black women and Black men actually in the workplace. So whether or not someone could wear things like braids, which I have right now, or someone could have what are known as locks, or if someone can wear other traditionally ethnic styles, which would result in their hair not being treated with relaxers or other chemical straighteners, right? So you're just rocking your natural hair texture, whether it's an afro or some other style. For that to have to be a conversation, for us to decide whether or not an entire group of people can wear their hair as it naturally grows out of their head, is an example of the ways in which whiteness drives our cultural experience. Because I've never heard a question about whether or not what could be perceived as a feature that is commonly held to white Americans, whether or not that would be acceptable in the workplace. And I'm talking about like the natural way that your hair grows out of your hair, or the natural way that your features show up. And so that's very important with the conversation, because when we understand that there is no absence of a default, we can make effective changes, right? Because again, everybody is operating off of this normalized version of what community looks like, of what acceptable looks like. And until we begin to break that down, we'll continue to get stuck. So I want us to continue thinking that through. Casual racism, which is the partner of microaggression, which I'm going to get to in a second, are all of the little ways in which we display racism, whether it's in thought, word, or deed, that is not the person with the white hood on. It's the, oh, you're so articulate, or, oh, I'm just going to touch your hair without asking permission. Or I think that I have the right to be fascinated by your features and touch them, right? That's an example of casual racism. Again, it's all of the little underlying ways in which we show racist attitudes or thoughts or words or actions. And then colorism is the specific ways in which darker hued people, not just Black people, by the way, this is all non-white people, so people of color, the ways in which darker hued people are specifically discriminated against on the basis of their color. And so this is something that obviously is personal to me. You all can see that I am a darker skinned Black woman. And so I grew up in a family where a lot of my family members on my maternal side were fairer skinned. And my grandmother in particular was very light skinned. So there were times where I would go out with my grandmother and people didn't necessarily believe that I was her grandchild. And I would have a drastically different experience in places than she would. And she would have to speak up and say, hey, this is my grandchild. You can't say that, or you can't do that, right? Because people assumed, hey, this person is dark skinned, so I can treat them differently. And so there have been many studies which have been conducted to talk about the ways in which darker skinned people are disciplined at work, or have corrective action taken against them at work much more strictly or harshly than their fairer skinned counterparts. The ways in which darker skinned people are discriminated against in healthcare, as well as just in other cultural venues. It could be restaurants, concert venues, etc., right? It could be that they receive harsher sentence in the criminal justice system. It also could be that they're discriminated against for housing or even bank loans at higher rates than people who have lighter skin, even if that person is a person of color. And so featureism, which is the cousin of colorism, is essentially the version of colorism that deals with facial features. So again, I'll use myself as an example. I have a broader nose, fuller lips. My hair is considered what would be like 4C, so it is a kinkier texture. And, again, going back to darker skin, and in some cases, featureism can even get into talking about body differences as well, body diversity, because it is assumed that, okay, if this person has a broader nose, or if they have fuller lips, then they are not as desirable, or they are not as trustworthy as someone who has different features. So there have been studies done about this as well, that it is assumed that hair that is kinkier is less clean than straighter textured hair. Or it could be that, for certain jobs, like let's say a hostess job or something where looks are pretty much the driver, even sales positions, marketing positions, that if you have what is considered more Eurocentric features, or features that are more closely aligned with whiteness, then you are seen as more desirable and the better qualified candidate, even outside of your educational experience or experience in the field. So again, it has very serious implications for someone's lived experience when we think about colorism and featureism. So gentrification are the ways in which communities are forced to align with the concept of whiteness, largely through displacement and erasure of Black residents. So Detroit is an example, right, of ways in which gentrification is happening. LA is another great example. Most major cities are undergoing or have undergone significant amounts of gentrification over the last 20 years. And a lot of times it's posited as, well, this is making the community better and we are revitalizing the community, right? So when I was studying urban planning at DePaul, that was the conversation, that we're revitalizing communities. And at the time, I was like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, that is good to have a Starbucks. That would be dope to have a Whole Foods. But then when you realize that there were plenty of opportunities to have those things before, and that everybody deserves access to fresh produce, and everyone deserves access to public transportation, for example, or deserves access to great schools, then you start to see like, hey, maybe something else is at play here beyond just revitalizing it, especially when the people who could benefit from the revitalization are a lot of times pushed out because rents or home prices explode and they're forced to go back into other areas that are then fundamentally deprived of resources. So intergenerational trauma is the multi-generational experience of traumatic lived experiences based on race. So essentially it's saying that the effects of slavery are still affecting generations today. And so, you know, I'll give you all a peek behind the curtain in some of the conversations that happen in the Black community. One common one is the idea of corporal punishment or spanking children. And so there have been a ton of conversations over the last, I would say like 10, maybe even 20 years around the value of corporal punishment for Black children. And one of the huge discussion points is that honestly, the focus on corporal punishment being good for kids in the Black community is really a holdover from slavery, where we feel that we are entitled to beat our children because we were taught that beatings are what solve bad behavior. And so when you think about the impact of now, 6, 7 generations removed, probably more than that now, of slavery, you think about how we're still having to have that conversation now. And so it affects us in a myriad of different ways, including health-wise. So there have been studies that have been conducted that show some of the issues that are common in the Black community as far as high blood pressure and other issues related to preventable illnesses. In some cases are related to passed down, whether that is the impacts of stress or certain birth defects or issues at birth related to intergenerational trauma. And then again, we talked about intersectionality before, but that is the ways in which these multiple layers of identity, could be race and gender, race and sexual orientation, et cetera, all create a unique experience. And then a microaggression is essentially a cousin of casual racism, but microaggression is the umbrella term for all forms of bias which occur like very subtly. Every day it could be talking about hair texture, or as a woman saying, oh, are you sure you don't want to have kids? Like, oh, you sure you want to go for the promotion, right? That's a microaggression. But for casual racism, it's a microaggression which is specific to discussing race. And typically it relates to anti-Black racism. And then xenophobia is where we start getting into talking about some of the experiences of Black Americans who are not African American. And so up to this point, I hadn't really discussed this, but typically there are like 3 buckets of the Black experience. So you have African, Blacks who identify as African, and then you have Blacks who identify as Afro-Caribbean, which also includes Afro-Latinx in some cases, and then you have African American. And so with xenophobia, you could largely be talking about the Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Latinx and African experience in America as a Black person. So again, Black is the umbrella term for those 3 or 4 groups. But when you talk about xenophobia, you're just eliminating African Americans from the conversation because they are not considered to be from another country of origin, or potentially even what could be considered like another ethnic group. So next slide. All right. So we'll do the same thing again. Which of the preceding words is most familiar to you? Which definition is most unfamiliar? And which definition makes you most uncomfortable? So we're going to go back one slide. And I want you to take a look at those. I know that was a lot. Some of this might have been really new to you all. So Elizabeth, I'll ask you, which one were you most familiar with?
From this one, probably, I will say gentrification,
Okay.
because that's, I've lived in, a number of big cities and small towns that have been going through a lot of changes, and also working in city government. Although I'm not in the part of the city that does planning, there's lots of
Yep.
conversations always about concerns, that desire to improve, but also fear for the people who are going to be displaced by that.
Yes.
In terms of unfamiliar, well, again, it was, a lot of these words I've heard, but hearing you speak about them, I might think about them in a different way. But definitely, I would say colorism is one that I've become familiar with more recently. The first time in my life that I learned that colorism existed within people of color
Yes.
was really shocking to me. I remember it was my first year of college, and my roommate was Latina, and she was from Los Angeles. Her parents had immigrated from Zacatecas in southern Mexico, and she explained to me all about different color strata in Mexico, and how people were looked at being more light-skinned or more dark-skinned. And it had never in my life genuinely occurred to me that there were those kinds of considerations beyond just, black, brown, or white. And I really opened my eyes. And I'd say even more recently, there have been some great books. I don't know if you read The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, but that's been one of my favorite books that came out in 2020, which is really specifically, it's a novel, but it's very specifically about colorism in the African-American community. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I think, colorism and featureism are such unique discussions. And I think it's great for the Burbank community because so much of the entertainment industry is based there, right? And that's always the conversation with the entertainment industry is we don't see enough dark-skinned people represented on camera. We don't see enough people with diverse, hair textures or features, right? And so a lot of times when white industry executives hear this, they're like, but we put Black people in it, or we put a Latina person in this, like, what's going on? Yeah, but it was all, they were all fair skinned, or they all had straighter hair texture, or everybody had a weave and nobody had a natural hairstyle, right? Because again, that's such a level of representation, which starts to align with whiteness again, for sure. And then which one made you most uncomfortable?
Probably casual racism. And like you said, it's cousin microaggressions. Those are tough because, all of us who are well-meaning, you just worry a lot that you are committing this without realizing it. We've been talking some recently within the library staff and in conversations I've been having, with my family about the subject matter, about the importance of taking a second to think about, you have these reactions and you have these sort of sudden things you might do, but just sort of, I think it's a good life lesson in general. Just slow yourself down a touch and think about whether the desire to touch someone's hair or something like that is really appropriate to the situation. But I think it's really easy, even if you are a person who's well-meaning, who cares, who's trying to do their best to commit acts of casual racism or microaggressions. And again, it's something where you just have to admit you're going to do it and accept that, and then be aware of it and learn from it and move on, but don't pretend that you're not going to do it.
For sure. And I appreciate you bringing that up. One clarification I want to make is that, because I'm pretty sure people have heard this too, is that racism is something that is unique and one directional. So Black people and people of color cannot be racist, right? Because we do not have enough power or influence to change the system, which again is centered and founded on whiteness. But we can all be discriminatory. So when we talk about microaggressions, everybody can exhibit microaggressions, right? And I have to check myself about this regularly. So when I see a person, do I automatically think like, okay, well, what are they doing? Well, why would you think that, right? Is it because this is like a darker skinned man who, has a certain hair texture? Well, so guess what? Like, that's wrong. That's a discriminatory behavior. This man is minding his business. He's not even thinking about you, right? So all of us can show up with microaggressions toward people for many different reasons. And it's an ongoing process to think about and question ourselves about why. Why am I thinking about this? Why do I feel this way? Why am I holding this thought and this belief? So yes, thank you for that vulnerability. So we'll go to the next slide. And of course, the homework You're probably familiar with this by now, but I want you all to look up media pieces which discuss aspects and applications of the word which made you the most uncomfortable, because I want you to challenge yourself to learn and become comfortable having these conversations, even if it's just with yourself. So next slide. Let's talk about bias. So understanding bias, and there are three aspects to consider. So there are layers to bias. Bias has rewards, and then there is an impact of bias. So with bias, there are four layers. There's the cognitive layer, the emotional layer, the individual layer, and then the collective layer of bias. So with the cognitive layer, cognitive relates to thinking, language, right? So what's happening here, so you could think of it as head. Our cognitive biases are the ones in which we see something and a thought comes to mind of I'm in danger, or this person isn't safe, or this person isn't as smart, or this person isn't as qualified, right? Emotional, on the other hand, is the heart of the matter. So this is when you have feelings about something. So it's when you see a person, it could even be see a person succeed, right? So some people have like real visceral reactions to hearing about a particular accomplishment by a Black person, and they feel offended, or they feel upset, or they feel confused, right? Because maybe they didn't think that was something that a Black person could accomplish. Maybe they had never seen it before. And then there's the individual layer of bias, which is you personally, right? So your own cognition, your own emotions. But then there's also the collective layer of bias. So we experience bias as groups too. So for example, and a lot of us might be familiar with this if we've ever taken an intro psych course, where we learn about like bystander effect and mob mentalities, where you see, okay, by myself, I don't really display, overtly racist behaviors. But if it's 10 of us and somebody starts speaking ill of a Black person, then it's like, oh, you know what? Actually, yeah, I do feel that way. Yes, this is happening. And sometimes we're often surprised at how our collective behaviors differ very much from our individual behaviors. So you want to understand your locus of control and then act on that. You cannot control your childhood. So if you were raised by people which you now have come to realize, like, man, my parents were racist, right? Or my grandparents were racist. You can't control that because you had no control over that as a child. You also cannot control the actions of others. So if your supervisor or your colleagues are displaying racist behaviors, you really can't change that. And you also can't change the mainstream cultural portrayal for the most part. Now, if you work in the entertainment industry, then yes, you probably have way more influence than most people. But for the most part, we can't change what we see on the TV, right? What we can control are our own individual actions. We can always control how we unpack our own individual experiences, whether that's what we see, what we've done, what we thought, what we have said. And then we can also control our cross-cultural education. So we can always pursue deeper knowledge. And I want to pause with that because a lot of us, we go to like the mainstream sources, so the sources that have become popular. But I want that to become your starting point, and we're going to talk more about that when we get to actions to take. But your starting point doesn't have to be your end point. That's just the beginning. You can feel free to go down a rabbit hole with learning about stuff that you didn't know anything about, because that's how we grow and that's how we stretch and that's how we challenge ourselves. And so with focusing on what we can control, our actions, our thoughts, what we learn, what we say, what we do, that's when we can start to manage our expectations of other people and ourselves. And then we can also manage our memories because we'll know how to interpret the memory based on the current information which we've learned. So here's an activity. I'd like for you to first think about, do you activate by thought or do you activate by emotion? All of us have the capacity to do both. So nobody is all one way or the other, but we do all have a typical way in which we show up. So for example, for me, I tend to lead with cognition. I'm much more logical than emotional. And so because I tend to lead by thought, I have to be very deliberate about checking in with my emotions about something. And so a lot of times I'll set aside time, like at the end of the day, and this is just like a tip in general, I set aside time at the end of each day to say, okay, well, what happened today? How did you feel about that? And just kind of wait and check in and see, okay, oh, that hurt my feelings when such and such happened, or that really made me angry. that will help you to process through all of the external influences which are going to be seeking to control this conversation that you're having with yourself about anti-racism. So if you've had to spend all day looking at news stories or having conversations with people in the community or hearing your family members talk about stuff, all of that is like piling on for you. And so if you tend to lead with emotions and you feel like you are just emotionally overwhelmed, take a second to step into your cognitive side and think through, okay, well, where is this feeling coming from? Is this being triggered by a childhood memory? Is this being triggered by maybe an experience that I had that made me uncomfortable? And work through that. If you lead with cognition, like me, then you want to take time to step in and check in with yourself and say, okay, well, how did I feel about that? You know, when I heard about that act of police brutality, or when I heard that definition that I'd never heard before and I wanted to reject it, did I feel angry? Well, where did that anger come from? And you check in with yourself with no judgment, but that check-in process is really important. And so when you start to consider that, you start to think, well, what's my bias trigger, right? When I'm biased against something, what's the thing that triggers me to feel biased? What's the thing where it's like a switch flips and then I step into my own personal biases? And then do they escalate more quickly when alone or in a group, right? So for some of us, we could turn our own selves up. we know how to pour the gas into our own tank. But with some of us, we're totally fine if it's just us. But when we get with certain groups or certain people, then it's like we turn into a whole different person, right? And then finally, do you mitigate your biases more quickly when you're alone or with the group? So for some of us, if we're by ourselves, we can sit and stew in something and it just grows. And then when we get with a group and one of our friends checks us like, hey, you know, what's going on with you? Why do you think like that? Then we find we calm down much more quickly. For some of us, it's the other way, where when we're alone, we can easily check ourselves and be like, hold on, where is that coming from? But if we're with a group, it'll swirl and swirl and swirl and swirl, and it's growing and expanding. And before we know it, it's escalated into a much bigger issue. So again, I like being transparent. I am a person where my biases tend to escalate more quickly when I'm alone, but it's also easier for me to mitigate them, particularly when I'm making the choice to step in and check in with my emotions. Because again, for me, if it's just my thoughts, I'm going all over the place. I'm here, and I'm putting together all these connections. It's like wild. And then I have to stop myself and be like, hold on, girl, where are you going with this? Like, this is crazy. So that check-in process is really important to me. And I like doing it outside of a group and I think it's because of the work that I do. It's just easier for me to kind of control that and get grounded in who I am and what I believe. So that is a helpful process that I hope you all take to heart, and you could apply that to really any part of your life, not even just anti-racism. Next slide. So what are the rewards of bias, right? Bias has many, many rewards, but let's start with, again, we have the 4 layers of bias. So the cognitive, the emotional, the individual, and the collective, right? But bias rewards us by giving us power. Because for you to even be able to take action on your bias in any meaningful way means that you have the power to control someone else's lived experience. And that power shows up in 4 ways: emotional, social, financial, and political. When we have emotional power over someone, we can have the power to make people feel afraid. We can have the power to make people feel anxious. We can have the power to make people feel lonely or isolated. And so I'm bringing this up because that's a large part of the conversation which you've been hearing, where Black professionals and Black community members have been speaking up to say, I don't feel comfortable around the police, or I don't feel comfortable having conversations with my supervisor about performance because I feel like I'll be judged harshly. That is because there is now a power dynamic at play, which rewards the ability to make people uncomfortable. So again, if you have emotional power over someone through bias, you have the power to potentially trigger and shift someone's emotional state. When you think about social power, this is where like the new Karen persona becomes much more prominent. Because if you have the power to say, why are you here? I don't feel you should be here, right? Or control someone's space. That's an example of social power. Because who are you to determine where someone can be? especially just based off of features or the color of their skin, right? You don't know that person and you don't have control over their presence or their physical place in space. So the third type of power is financial power. And this is where we start getting into conversations about mortgage and housing discrimination. So controlling who can live where, who has access to the financial benefits of home ownership, which we all know are wide reaching and wide ranging, who controls salaries and wages, whether or not people are making less or making market value for the work that they do, regardless of their education level, which we've now learned that there are huge pay inequities between Black and white professionals. Financial power also results in the idea of who has access to information about money. So who has access through the education system to learn about stocks and trading and investment, right? All of that is a form of power which is driven by these biases. And then finally, political power, which would be the top layer. So if we built all of them on top of each other, emotional power, which influences social power, which influences financial power, which then influences political power, says, if I am the person who controls money and who can shift emotions and who can decide who can be where and who can be present in certain spaces, whether culturally or physically, then I have a lot of political power to determine what policies are put in place. And so we're seeing a lot of that conversation now around certain laws, which we're now learning are unjust. So for some people, they had no idea that the criminal justice system was as biased as it actually is. To most Black people, that was like, yeah, duh. We knew that a long time ago, right? But for a lot of people, they're just now learning that because they had such a drastically different experience that they never even had to think of the fact that, like, wow, there were actually laws which have been made, which were designed to make sure that Black people could have a drastically different and drastically inferior lived experience than white people. So next slide. The impact of bias has three: exclusion, privilege, and inequity. So bias excludes others due to difference. And then difference leads to the privileged groups accumulating even more power. And then that centralized power is going to concentrate and exponentially increase inequity. Next slide. So let's go back through the timeline again. And now let's talk about the ways in which these stereotypes show up throughout the phases of history. So first, of course, when Black people or African people were first kidnapped and then illegally brought to the United States for the purposes of becoming enslaved, the concept of Black inferiority became entrenched in the American psyche and escalated and grew and grew and grew to infect and impact every part of American life. So this concept of, by default, if you are Black, you are less than white people, kicked off with the kickoff of slavery in America. We then started to see, when the slave trade exploded, we started to see stereotypes such as Jezebel, Buck, and Mammy. And so let's talk about each of those three. So the Jezebel stereotype is the hypersexualized image of Black women, that Black women are purposely overtly sexual and tempting men and have no control over their sex drive, which is why they are, quote unquote, breeding or having children at exponentially higher rates than other groups. First and foremost, that is not true at all. Rates, particularly of teen pregnancy in the Black community, have drastically dropped over the last, I think, 20 years in particular, even more so than other groups. So again, these are the stereotypes that you can see how far back that stereotype started around Black women's sexuality, right? This is 1793. And then the Buck stereotype, which is the male side of that, is this hypersexualized image of Black men, that they are uncontrollable and have uncontrollable lust, and they are only good for breeding, right? Or the production of more children, which really were considered property of a slave owner for the purposes of creating more economic gain for that particular owner. We also came up with the Mammy stereotype at this time. So this is the polar opposite of the Jezebel. So this is usually an overweight woman, typically dark skinned, who is the caretaker and nurturer of the house. They cook, they clean, they are asexual, they have no emotion, they exist solely for the purpose of caring for other people. So when Black women talk about concepts like muling, which is the ways in which Black women are disproportionately expected to take on the emotional burden of work or with team dynamics at work and expected to do work with no concern for their personal and psychological safety, this goes all the way back to that mammy stereotype, that we are asexual, we have no emotion, we have no personal desire to be seen as equal or to be seen as human. So then when we move into the mid 1800s or mid 19th century, we see the Uncle Tom narrative come out, which is where you have a person, and I want to also clarify, the Uncle Tom stereotype is drastically different than the actual Uncle Tom character in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So if anybody has read Uncle Tom, you'll know what emerges as stereotype is actually not really what happened with his character anyway. So that's an aside. But the Uncle Tom stereotype is one of a Black person who is willing to sell out other Black people at all costs for the goal of white acceptance. And so we see that now when we have, and I won't name names, but there are people that have come out in recent news stories where people say, hey, that's an Uncle Tom, right? And so this is where this comes from, is this idea that during the abolitionist movement growing and gaining steam and traction in the United States, you had Black people who were willing to work to keep other Black people enslaved just so that they could hopefully be accepted as a white person, even though they weren't and would still be enslaved themselves. And then you have the minstrel, which is the person who, again, they have, like the mammy, they have no personal autonomy, no personal identity. They exist solely for the entertainment of white people, and they're willing to do anything to entertain and please white people. And then the pickaninny persona emerges, which is the child version in a way of the minstrel stereotype. And so pickaninnies are seen as disposable children who sometimes could be hypersexualized or just used essentially as tools, whether it was around a plantation or for the purposes of working, but because they were not viewed as human, and especially not as human children, they were seen as disposable. And so we can see some of the ways in which that has emerged even now and continues even now with the ways in which Black children are often punished at higher rates than their white counterparts. They are often sentenced to higher sentences in the criminal justice system, and they are not even called children. So when you think a lot of times, especially after like age 12, Tamir Rice is an example of a child who, I mean, this is a little kid, and the way they are described in the media oftentimes is the same way you might describe an adult, even though they're not. So when we get into the Reconstruction era, the Sambo, Jim Crow, and Gollywog personas emerge. And so Sambo is another example of a character that's designed, again, just for entertainment. This person is oafish, they lack common sense, they're not articulate, they are not intellectual in any way, they're just silly, right? They're just silly and they have no intellectual capacity to think through in the same way that a white person would. And then the other side to that, the northern counterpart, so Sambo was largely like a southern characterization. The northern counterpart to that was Jim Crow, which emerged as, again, silly, lack of intellectualism, and unable to thrive on their own, had to be partnering with a white person in order to survive because they are seen as inferior. And finally, Gollywog is actually a character which was developed to be a doll for people, Black and white children alike, but the features and the design of the doll largely, I would say, it took the stereotypes of Black features. And the problem with that is that, of course, when you think about kids and their toys, they start to create that as a form and a concept of, oh, this is what people are really like. And that's actually not true. So the problem with the Gollywog is not that a doll is a doll, but the issue is that the doll characterizes Black people in a way which is not actually accurate based on the Black experience and Black people as a diverse group within themselves. And so I want to point that out. There's actually a study that was conducted, I think in the 90s, maybe the late 80s, around children playing with dolls, and that they considered the white doll to be more beautiful, better behaved. They wanted to play with the white doll more than the Black doll. And these kids were like 4 or 5, like they were very young. So again, this stuff starts very early. And so now when we get to the mid 20th century, the Mandingo and tragic mulatta stereotypes emerge. And this is, again, playing on hypersexuality. So just like the buck stereotype from the 19th century. The Mandingo persona is just concerned about sex. He is considered especially virile, but that virility is also paired with almost like an animalistic drive towards sex, and in particular sex with white women, that they are seen as being beasts, prone to rape or other forms of sexual assault at unreasonably high rates. And on the other side of that, for women, it was a tragic mulatta. And this is somebody who is of mixed race, typically white and black mixed. And they are caught between these identities and cannot think on their own and would do anything to become white. They are unwilling to accept their status or their place as being black in America. And so with that, this gives us the excuse to penalize people. This gives us the excuse to dehumanize folks and not see them as individuals. We then move into this hypercapitalism rise. And this is where the welfare queen, the crackhead, and the drug lord personas emerge. So this is where we see, these huge images of drug dealers that are just infesting the streets and crack babies, right? That was all the wave. I remember that even being a little kid, that it was like, oh my God, by the time we get to 2020, it's just gonna be all these crack babies running around. And now we're learning, I think there was an article, it was either the Washington Post or maybe the New York Times, that just completely debunked that. And it's like, basically they literally said, hey, we thought it was gonna be this influx of people that were just ravaged by crack, and that actually didn't happen. And I think they may have apologized, because I think they contributed to that characterization. But again, the thing with all of these stereotypes is that it creates this sense of fear. When we talk again about the power from bias, it gets people emotional, you get scared, and then you start making policies and laws and restrictions because you don't want to be associated with that. And you don't want that to infect the experience that you're having, even though none of this stuff is true, right? Because people are individuals and they live their own unique lives in every way. And so the final stereotypes I want to talk about are the thug, the vixen, and the magical Negro. So, with these, you have the thug come out. So this is where you say, okay, well, because of this rap music, there's all of these people and they're just concerned with violence and all they care about is violence and rape, and they have no moral standards, right? Same thing with the vixen. But the truth is that a lot of it is just that, a character, right? So we see that now with a lot of rappers. My friends and I, we laugh about it because a lot of the rappers who we were like, oh my gosh, as a kid, man, this person is such a thug and they do this. And they got like cooking channels on YouTube and they buying their wife flowers like every day and all of this crazy stuff. And it's like, wait, what? This is completely incongruent with how we were taught to characterize you. But the reality is, again, is that people are not a monolith. People have a spectrum of behaviors and beliefs, and they show up in a myriad of different ways, and they're unique individuals and should be taken as such. So next slide. So which of these stereotypes is most familiar to you and which is least familiar? So I know that was a lot. So we'll actually, and so I'll ask these questions and then we'll go back to the slide. How did it feel to hear the stereotype names? But for some of you, you may not have even ever heard those names before. And then what emotions came up for you when you heard that? Did you feel a reaction in your body when you heard certain words? If so, where? And describe the sensation that you felt to yourself. So we'll go back one slide. And I want you to check these out and look through and think through what you just heard. And then I want you to think about what stereotype you typically associate with Black people. And you don't have to share this aloud with anybody or tell anyone, but just within yourself. Which one do you typically, when you think of a Black person, that's the one that comes to mind? All right, as we move on, we'll go forward 2 slides. I want to talk a little bit about the magical Negro stereotype too, because I left that one out, but I want to bring it up because this is where we get into a false positive with the stereotype. And so we think, well, no, I'm not saying that Black people are inferior. You know, I think I know some of the smartest Black people ever. Some of our best friends are Black and they're awesome. They don't do this and they don't do that. But that magical Negro stereotype of you have to be overly perfect and you have to be, you know, overly nice and you can't ever make mistakes and you have to be exceptional and brilliant. It's not enough to just be mediocre. It's also just as harmful as the very negative stereotypes and the overtly negative stereotypes like a buck or a mammy or a mandingo or tragic mulatto, right? Because again, any stereotype is something that takes away someone's right to show up as an individual. So I have to be neither exceptional nor depraved in order to just be human. I could just be mediocre. Like maybe I'm just kind of smart, or maybe there are things that I'm really smart in, but other stuff that I don't know that much. And that's okay too, right? I'm still just as Black and still worthy of the same nurturing and care and place as everybody else in society. Because again, we're all diverse within ourselves. So let's talk about unlearning anti-Blackness and making that personal sacrifice. So this is where we get into understanding where we can all take action. So anti-racism, again, or ally, I'm sorry, is again a person who offers ongoing support to somebody from an underrepresented group. And anti-racism is the deliberate, purposeful, consistent action of dismantling the systems of racism. Belonging is where we all get the opportunity to feel a sense of place and purpose in a community. And that community could be our job, it could be where we live, it could be where we play, it could be where we go to hang out with our friends, and it could even be virtually, right? Because now that we're all creating these virtual communities, you can absolutely create a sense of belonging there as well. To be a champion is somebody who is actively looking for ways to lift up Black people in their circle of influence. So if you are a champion, for example, for Black children in your neighborhood, you could make sure that you're looking for ways to include Black kids in the community in the Little League. Or in another activity, or in the Girl Scout troop, right? So you're looking out to say, well, hey, where's so-and-so? They just moved in. I want to make sure to tell them about this so that they can get involved as well. Culture are the shared values and customs that are unique to a particular group. So when we talk about culture, this is really important because it helps us to understand that there are certain things that are typically unique to one group that another group may not either be aware of, like, or accept. And that doesn't matter. That's their culture. Inequity, of course, is a system where people exist on different stratas within a particular community or a place or group. So if something is unequal, that means somebody's lived experience is going to be drastically or subtly different than someone else's. Psychological safety is the concept of someone being able to feel a sense of belonging mentally or emotionally in a place. So they may not ever say it, it may not ever come out overtly, but if I feel anxious every time I come to my job because I have a coworker who is constantly expressing microaggressions, that is a threat and it undermines my psychological safety, which is just as important as my physical safety. Sponsorship is where you take on the role to actively give someone or support someone in getting an opportunity. So we hear sponsorship a lot at work. And so sponsorship could take the form of you speaking up for someone to get on a stretch assignment at work, or it could be you nominating someone for a particular leadership role in a community organization. Systemic inequity, which is different than inequity from the standpoint that it is baked into our political, economic, and social systems. And so this is tightly connected to systemic racism. And finally, womanism is essentially the brand of feminism which is specific to Black women. So if anyone on the call is a feminist, or you remember the feminist movements of the 1970s, you'll know that there were a lot of issues with Black women feeling as though their concerns specific to their community were not taken into account. And so womanism emerged as a response to that to explain the unique intersectionality or intersectional experience of Black women and ways in which that particular brand of feminism needed to speak to those differences. Next slide. All right, so y'all know the drill. Which of the preceding words is most familiar to you, and which definition is most unfamiliar? And then finally, which definition makes you most uncomfortable? So I'll go back one slide so you can see. And Elizabeth, I'll let you take it away. So which one, I know we're almost at time, but I wanted to know which one, let's start with the one that made you most uncomfortable, just in the interest of time.
I'm going to say psychological safety.
Okay.
And it's obviously very important. And the reason it made me uncomfortable was not because I don't understand why it's valuable, but because I am a manager in an organization. And one of the things you worry about as a manager is not knowing what the people in the organization are really feeling,
Yes.
whether they are able to express. Like that's something I would worry about. Are people on my staff able to express if they aren't feeling psychologically safe? And I guess I wouldn't necessarily know how to go about asking the question without it also feeling like, you know, I'm singling someone out or making assumptions about them. So that strikes me as a complicated one that I should definitely spend some time on, and makes me uncomfortable because I don't already feel like I've figured it out.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think psychological safety is a tough one for everybody because we can't always know what's in another person's mind. And so sometimes we're kind of shooting darts into the air, like just tossing them, hoping that we're landing on making people feel safe. But there are definitely ways as a manager that you can help people to feel comfortable. First of all, sharing with you ways in which they feel unsafe. But then also on ways which you can do both preventive and prescriptive measures to make sure that people have a sense of psychological safety. And there's tons of research out there about this. So of course, as always, your homework is to do your research and find at least 4 pieces of media which discuss aspects and applications of your most uncomfortable definition. And so if yours is like Elizabeth's and it's psychological safety, you can feel free to pick up tons of resources which will discuss how to help you build in that safety for the people around you and yourself. So next slide. All right, so 2000s to present, we have 4 key elements which lead to what I call enmeshed erasure. That's gentrification, cultural appropriation, tokenism, and intrusion. So gentrification, which we already discussed that definition, is the ways in which we control place, right? Where people live, what their experience is in the place where they live. Cultural appropriation is where we start to control and take and co-opt pieces of people's culture. So one example is, again, we talk about hair. You know, for years, it was that cornrows and other natural, especially braided styles, particularly on Black women, were unprofessional and should not be in the workplace. So now when we see people wearing cornrows on runways and other, you know, fun things seen as being, oh, this is edgy and it's so accepted, it feels offensive because my actual lived experience has been impacted by someone's wrong stereotype of this hairstyle. And so when we think about cultural appropriation, the key to always keep in mind is that there are questions that you should be asking yourself. And the first question is, who originated this particular style, right? So who was the originator of it? Then ask yourself, what were the consequences for them originating this style? So if you end up finding that the people who originated the style were systemically held back from expression with this, then you can over-index on being sensitive to the fact that you choosing to put it on and take it off could be seen as offensive. And then finally, to think about what is the impact that I would have by essentially dabbling into this, and am I crediting people appropriately for being the originator of this style? When we ask ourselves these questions and then modify our behavior in response, it takes on a very different tone. And that is where we get into people feeling respected and appreciated instead of feeling like their culture is being co-opted unnecessarily and unfairly. So intrusion is where you just step into somebody's culture. So one example could be, you know, there are a lot of conversations around, you know, let's say it's a TV show that traditionally has featured all Black people on it. And maybe the show with Black people started because folks didn't feel like they got a chance to be on predominantly white shows. So then when you bring white people in it, then it feels like, well, wow, you're intruding on our space, right? And for a lot of people, they don't understand. They're like, well, you can't just say you own it. But again, remember, whiteness as the default has always been creating those lines and boundaries since the beginning of the Black experience in this country. It's just that now there is a power dynamic which says I can control where I choose to go and what spaces I can occupy. And then finally, tokenism. This is where you pick like 1 or 2 Black people and hold them up as, you know, magical Negro stereotype, but this is the person who made it. So I know there isn't racism or there isn't a problem. All 4 of these issues create a sense of enmeshed erasure. So this is where Black people are present and they're technically a part of the conversation, but their individuality and their power has been stripped or erased, and they are not able to advocate for themselves. So next slide. When we think about actions to take now, the goal and the work of anti-racism is to actively work against that enmeshed erasure. It is to say, I am choosing to take actions which will make it so that people get to exist as individuals, and that whole spectrum of lived experience, no matter what I feel is the value, people have a right to be themselves, and they have a right to exist and have the same level of comfort and safety that I do, regardless of their race. And that takes deliberate, consistent action. So let's talk about what you can do. There are three main buckets. First, you can learn. So immerse yourself in past and present Black thought. That's why every piece of homework I gave you involves you just doing research and reading and becoming knowledgeable in this stuff. You also want to make sure that you prioritize Black voices from all perspectives. So don't just read the safe perspectives that you've been taught are valid. Read the ones that you think are really extreme too, because they have nuggets of wisdom that can at least help you understand the spectrum of Black thought on an issue. I love reading stuff that challenges me and that I don't think is right. It's probably the researcher in me. But I love it because it gives me a chance to question, well, why do I think that that's not acceptable? And it doesn't mean I'll change my mind, but it does mean that I'm educating myself on the full breadth of knowledge that's available to me. And so the second thing you want to do is question. Realize that you have been misled. All of us have constantly been misled about what it means to be Black, who is Black, what is the Black experience like? And I hope you can see that from the stereotypes which I named. And so when you recognize that you've been misled, it should hopefully help you to document your bias and the knowledge that you're gaining through your research, because then you can start to write stuff down and you're like, you know what? I do sometimes think of Black women as being overly sexual for reasons that don't even really make sense. That's not good. I think I want to change that. And over time, as you document and journal this knowledge you're gaining, you'll start to see your own mindsets and thoughts and actions shift. And then finally, you want to pivot. So the goal is to change behaviors that you know are racist and are showing up as anti-Black. The first thing you want to make sure that you do is influence your inner circle. A lot of us try to run to social media and we say, oh my God, I gotta go tell them I saw somebody saying something racist on LinkedIn or on Facebook. I'm gonna tell them off. No, you don't know them. They're a stranger. The most influence that you can have is on the people who are closest to you. And guess what? There is nobody that's closer to you than you. And that's why I told you at the beginning, the first person you should be trying to influence is yourself. What are you learning? What are you saying? What are you thinking? What are you believing? And then what are your actions as a result of those thoughts, words, and beliefs? And then as you influence your inner circle, so this will be your family, your close friends, and of course yourself, choose a focus area and set a goal. So for example, you may find that you want to learn more about Black stereotypes in the media. That could take you years to dig through all of that. You're not going to eat the whole pie in one sitting. You got to eat it one slice at a time. Maybe you want to learn more about gentrification. So you start doing deep dives and reading and seeing articles about that. But pick a focus area and then set goals with times on it. So in 6 months, I want to learn more about that, and that. When you set those goals, now it helps to give you a sense of accomplishment, and you can create differences in specific behaviors and thoughts that you have. So again, you want to learn, you want to question, and you want to pivot. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to take questions because I think we have a couple that are in the Q&A in the last couple moments that we have, because I want to make sure that you get what you need before we end for the evening.
Thank you, Kalyn. I'll start with the easy question that I can answer. Will a recording be made available? We are recording this, and sometime next week it should be on the library's YouTube channel, which if you didn't know about it, you can go start at our website, burbanklibrary.org, and you'll be able to find that. The other question is, if I compliment a Black woman on how beautiful her hair is, as I did a Lyft driver whose hair was natural and curly, will that be interpreted as featureism? To me, the questioner, it was a sincere/natural thing to say to another woman.
Yeah, so I think the best question is to think about how far you went with it, right? So if I say, oh my gosh, Elizabeth, I love the color of your top, and I stop there, that's a beautiful compliment. And I'm sure she'll smile, she might blush a little bit, her cheeks might turn the same color as her shirt. But if I say, oh my God, Elizabeth, that's such a beautiful shirt. I didn't even know women that were as fair as you. Like, I've never seen white women wear that color. That's like, wow. Right now I've crossed the line, right? So it's when you say, oh my God, your hair is so beautiful. I didn't even know Black women could wear their hair like that. It's like, that's a microaggression, right? But just saying like, oh, girl, your hair is beautiful. Totally fine.
All right, another question. A little bit of a long one, so bear with me.
Okay.
The quote, "You are so articulate" example. The questioner says, I've heard about that problem before, so now I feel like I cannot give a compliment about anything without screwing up. How do I know where the line is drawn, or is it better to keep any compliments to myself? And then there's an example about an online webinar with some nonprofit directors on a panel. One of them was head and shoulders above the others in getting the bigger picture and what the future looks like for the arts community. I thought I'd send her a note that she was that strong, but then I thought about how it would land on the other end because she was a person of color.
Yeah, so first I want to say I like the fact that you questioned yourself. I know that probably felt uncomfortable, right? But I think it's super dope that you thought about it and said, hold on, did that show up as anti-Black? That's good. And you're going to keep having those moments. So the moment of questioning in and of itself is not the problem, right? You always want to transmute those emotions or those thoughts into meaningful action. So the discomfort of asking the question is discomfort of feeling like, oh, did I do something wrong? Great, that's your starting point. The deeper questions you want to ask yourself are, did you say that to her because of the influence on the project as a professional, meaning you could have said the same compliment to anyone regardless of race? Or did you say that because whether consciously or subconsciously, you were surprised that a Black person could show up that strong in this space? If it is the former, meaning you were just happy somebody was able to pull all of this stuff together so you all could be more efficient in the work, that's totally fine. You should always compliment people and feel free to tell people when they do a great job. But if it's actually the latter, again, even if it was subconscious, and as you start digging, you see like, oh, I said that because I really didn't expect her to show up like that, because actually I don't think I've ever seen a Black person show up like that, and that was surprising to me, then yeah, that would be an example of a microaggression. And so then what you want to do is say, well, now, first of all, I have seen it. I just saw a Black person show up strong. So I can no longer say that I don't know that exists, and recognize that there are tons of talented people across the spectrum in all types of industries, and anybody could show up strong at any time. And then if you want to and you feel comfortable, feel free to connect with that person just as a professional and build a relationship so that you can get to know them, again, as an individual and understand the full spectrum of who they are and build that sense of community.
All right, thank you. And the person who asked that question thanks you too. The next question, can you talk about the difference between cultural appropriation versus mainstreaming of a style, or just appreciating a style or food?
Yeah, so to be honest, thank you for asking that question. To be honest, sometimes there isn't a line, right? So sometimes when we think, oh, I'm just appreciating this. Yeah, but your appreciation is coming at the expense and the erasure of someone else, right? So, and even I have to check myself with this, because again, Black people can show up as anti-Black, though they cannot be racist, right? So if there are certain styles, like I'll give you an example. Of course, everybody's working from home right now, and I normally would dress up for work when I would go into the office. And so with being home, people were a lot more casual, but I was like, no, I still got to dress up like it's work. And I had to stop and unpack, like, why do I feel this pressure to look a certain way at work? Like, where did this come from? And again, it was just a non-judgmental question. I'm just digging through. And I realized that it really went all the way back to high school when we were taught about professionalism and that you don't want to be seen as ghetto when you go to work. So your hair has to look a certain way. You have to be dressed a certain way and da-da-da. So there are ways in which I don't even display my own culture, or didn't previously to this year, because I felt a fear of being seen as less than. So when I see colleagues come in and they're essentially just kind of dabbling in a style and playing in it because they think it's fun or edgy or is considered not mainstream, then it does feel offensive, because I've now had to unpack 20 years of believing that something that's so natural to my culture was not good enough, right? And again, it's not that it's not even necessarily that you can't wear something, though in some cases, honestly, you probably shouldn't, right? Um, but it's more with checking yourself about the why. And also credit is a big part of that. So when people wear things and like I think they call cornrows, I think it was like Bo Derek braids or something like that a couple years ago. I think Kim Kardashian wore them. And Black women were up in arms. Like, that's not Bo Derek braids, man, that's cornrows. So it's like that level of erasure creates some of the more negative responses. So it's just about checking yourself and doing your research to understand where things come from. And this even applies a lot of times to like indigenous cultural appropriation too. So some things are sacred from a spiritual standpoint and we play with it. Like we put it on as costumes or other things. And it's like, no, but that's actually very sacred. And so that's not really something to be played with. So just do your research and educate yourself to understand the origins of things and whether or not people are being credited appropriately.
Great, thank you. Then one person is curious how many participants we've had tonight, and it's been about 25.
Oh, wow, okay.
This evening. So hopefully, if you enjoyed it, those of you in the audience, you can find the link when we've got the recording up and recommend it to your friends. And then just some thank yous and compliments for you. And you are awesome, 2 exclamation points. I completely agree with that. So
thank you so much.
Those are our questions.
Well, I just want to thank everyone so much for coming tonight. I know some of this information might have been challenging to hear and see, but I have a personal conviction that I don't open any wound that I don't have the willingness or ability to heal. And so some of the things which I discussed tonight, which may have seemed a little bit more provocative, I hope that you're able to do more research and learn to trust yourself as you go through this learning process and growing process with just learning how to be anti-racist. And I just want to make sure to also say that it's an ongoing journey and all of us are learning and we'll continue to learn how to do this work and how to actively, purposely, deliberately, and consistently work to dismantle these systems of racism. So thank you all so much for having me tonight. I'm so appreciative. And if you'd like to learn more about me, I do a lot of writing. And I'm going to be doing even more writing. You can visit me at www.godreamforward.com, or you can feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. I make a lot of noise over there, and I'm just simply Kalyn Wilson on LinkedIn.
Thank you again so much, Kalyn. I learned a ton as well, and really it was some challenging subject matter, but you walked us through it in a way that made it very accessible and understandable. So with that, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to David just for a few closing remarks and announcements.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalyn Wilson. That was really an engaging program, and just speaking for myself, I found it very thought-provoking. I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. And thanks to all of you who attended for your questions. Before we finish tonight, I would like to let you know about a few upcoming programs in this series. On Saturday, October 17th, from 2 to 3:30 p.m., you can join in a community conversation led by library staff about the topics that the book, The Hate U Give, brings to the fore: identity, racism, police-community relations, class, poverty, white privilege, and social justice. Then on Thursday, October 29th, from 7 to 8:30 p.m., you can join a Zoom panel discussion, Color Changes Everything: Racial Diversity in Animation. You can learn more and register at burbanklibrary.org. When you leave this evening, you will be redirected to an evaluation form. We would really appreciate it if you could fill this out. One question will ask you what ideas you have for actions the library, the city of Burbank, or individuals or groups in Burbank could take to continue improving racial equity. Please share your ideas. And if you think of one later, you can contribute your thoughts on our website, burbanklibrary.org. Thank you again, and have a good evening.